We're very fortunate to have all our speakers tonight, and we're especially fortunate to have with us the Executive Director of the North Carolina Council of Churches, George Reed. And he was reminding me when we were discussing the limitations on speaking that he's particularly challenged in this area because he's both a preacher and a lawyer. So, and I'm a lawyer, so I know half of that story anyway. So anyway, let me invite George to come up and share with us.
Thank you, Tom. I am going to try my best, as Yvonne has done, to leave a little bit of my 20 minutes for any questions or comments that you might have, but I am challenged, as Tom has acknowledged. I want to do three things with you tonight. I want to talk, first of all, about the political climate and issues before the North Carolina General Assembly that are affecting or will affect people who live in poverty. Second, I want to say just a couple of words about what you might do about some of those issues if they are important to you. And thirdly, I want to say a brief word about resources that the North Carolina Council of Churches can offer to you in that work. So let me start by saying a word about issues before the North Carolina General Assembly. And to do that, I have to start by saying a word or two about the political climate that we're operating in today. My family and I are members at Pilgrim Baptist in Raleigh. They had asked me to come on the Wednesday night following the elections last November to do kind of a reflection on what had happened in the elections and what that meant. And I went in with about 20 bad things that I said would probably happen in the General Assembly this year. And it is now known around Pilgrim as my doom and gloom speech. Afterwards, two people separately came over to my wife and said, "You have to go home with him tonight," because it's a really grim session of the General Assembly. I'm suspecting that many of you know that. Are all of you from Durham or Durham County? Anybody not from Durham? What? Where are you from?
Raleigh.
Raleigh, okay. Well, what I wanted, you got others?
Yeah.
Morrisville, okay, so Wake County. Yeah. Well, what I wanted to say to those of you who are in Durham, I hope you know that your legislative delegation is not typical. Do you know that?
Yes.
Okay. Very, very much not typical this year. We now have majorities in both House and Senate that are not, from my perspective, working on issues in favorable ways to people who live in poverty. I would say, in fact, that it is the most unfavorable General Assembly that I've seen in the 30-plus years that I've been working with legislative issues in this state. So I started kind of listing some issues I wanted to mention to you tonight, and I kept, even on the way over here, pulling out the piece of paper and adding things to it. And I know what I have is not a complete listing, even as is. And one of the things, if you want to talk about, after I say a few more words here, if you want to talk about other issues that are of concern to you that affect people in poverty, I would certainly welcome that. But I've got, at last count, 8 legislative issues. Excuse me, all but 2 of them are actually already introduced. In fact, 2 of them are already adopted. And the 2 that aren't introduced certainly will be. So this is not hypothetical stuff. This is real stuff. This is what's going on in this session of the General Assembly right now. So let me run through them quickly. First of all is unemployment insurance. You know, the General Assembly had hardly, the new members had hardly discovered where the bathrooms are located, which does take a little while in the General Assembly building. It's complex. Some of them were still unpacking the boxes in their offices, and they were passing legislation to reduce unemployment insurance, reduce how many weeks people can get unemployment, and reduce the amount of money they can get. It goes back to decisions made over the past 10 or 15 years to cut the taxes that businesses were paying to go into the unemployment insurance fund. The economy tanked, there wasn't enough money, and so the outcome of that is we're balancing all of that on the backs of people who are unemployed. So many of them are people already living in poverty. Many of them are at risk of slipping into poverty during their time of unemployment. And so that was the first one out of the hopper for the General Assembly, to cut unemployment insurance payments in significant ways. That was followed almost immediately by the decision not to take part in Medicaid expansion. Most of you know that the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare, allows states to expand their Medicaid coverage. In North Carolina, that would have provided Medicaid coverage for 500,000 or 600,000 people who by definition are people living in or near poverty. The first 3 years of that expansion would have been paid for entirely by the federal government, and after that only 10% of it would have been paid for by North Carolina. And our General Assembly and our governor acted quickly to say, no, we're not going to take part in Medicaid expansion. We're not going to take that money that's available, even though North Carolinians are paying into the pot out of which that money would come. So in effect, we'll be paying money so people in, dare I say, more enlightened, more compassionate states can provide. Well, one of the ironies of it, you know, this decision is all about politics, and the states that are declining the money are the ones led by a party that is not the party of our president, which shall remain nameless here. But what's happened now is that 8 of the governors of that party have decided, gee, it's too good of a deal to pass up. We're going to take that Medicaid expansion money that's out there, but North Carolina is not going to be one of those, at least here at the outset. So those are the 2 bills that are already done, finished, complete: the unemployment insurance and the refusal of Medicaid expansion. Another one that's has been introduced, has passed, I think, both houses at this point, has to do with the earned income tax credit. Something that helps working people who are living near or in poverty through a tax credit which is refundable, which means if they haven't paid as much tax as the credit is, they get money back. At the national level, it's done more than any program in the last 20 or 30 years to help lift working people out of poverty. North Carolina adopted a state plan 4 years ago. The bill that's under consideration and probably will be adopted right now cuts by a little bit that state earned income tax credit. But the really bad news there is that the whole credit at the state level is set to sunset, to expire at the end of this year, and the legislature has already pretty much staked themselves out that they're going to let it expire. It won't be continued. So, a third issue. The fourth one, you are probably hearing the talk about requiring a photo ID in order to vote. Well, that's also an issue that impacts people living in poverty disproportionately. The State Department of Motor Vehicles says that about 500,000 people in this state don't have driver's licenses, the photo ID that can most frequently be used. Those are going to be people who are elderly and have stopped driving, people who do not own a car, people who, for a variety of other reasons, living in and near poverty don't have that photo ID. And what this bill will do will be to make it more difficult for them to vote. Some of them won't vote, and then that lessens the impact that they can have on decisions that are made in the state. There's several other of these voter suppression ideas that probably will be introduced. They include reductions in Sunday voting, reductions in early voting, or reductions in same-day registration and voting, all of which seem pretty certain to make it more difficult for working people and people living in poverty to vote. So that's a fourth issue. A fifth one that has been introduced now is one to enable the payday lending industry to come back into North Carolina. 10, 12 years ago, our General Assembly, our governor, and our Attorney General worked hard and worked together to pretty much eliminate payday lending in this state. Payday lending, for those of you not familiar with it, is an industry that makes short-term, small loans to people, usually people really in financially dire straits, to enable them to live from payday to payday, which is why it's called payday lending. The interest rates on these loans can run up as high as 400% per year. And what happens to too many poor people is they get caught in a cycle of debt, a debt trap that they can't get out of, and they end up paying more money back to the lender in interest than they've gotten and been able to use in the principal. Sadly, we have a bill that's been introduced now to put payday lending back into business in this state. I've lost count. Is that number 5? Number 6, this whole issue about driver's licenses for immigrant youth. You've been hearing that one? That also has an overlay of poverty to it. Undocumented immigrants are among the most marginalized people in our state, among the poorest, and you give a young person a driver's license and you give him or her a vehicle, literally and figuratively, for pursuing education and for pursuing employment. And you make it more difficult for them if you say either you can't have a driver's license at all, and there is a bill in the General Assembly to say that, or you say, as the governor and others have said, we'll give you a driver's license, but it's going to be distinctive. It's going to be pink. It's going to say you're not really here legally. It's going to mark you in a way that's just really offensive to me. So that one's on the hopper, in the hopper as well. The two things that haven't been introduced yet but will be, one is the whole question of the state budget, and it will have almost certainly reductions in funding that will impact education and that will impact social services. And so we don't know exactly what those are going to look like, but they're going to have an impact on people living in poverty and on the public education system from pre-K through college that helps people to lift themselves out of poverty. And then the last issue that's not introduced yet is the whole question of tax reform. We know there will be a tax reform bill. Many of us have been working for years for tax reform, but it's not going to be the kind of tax reform we're going to get this year. What will probably happen this year will be a bill that will eliminate or greatly reduce the personal income tax, probably the corporate income tax. We'll make up the money by an increase in the sales tax to probably 8 or 9%, reductions of several exemptions and qualifications in the sales tax, and budget cuts that will cut the spending side of things as well. Of course, the problem is you move from the income tax, which is a progressive tax with people who can afford to pay more paying more, to a sales tax, which is a regressive tax that falls disproportionately heavily on people living in poverty. So that one we got to watch. That one's going to be trouble. What can you do? Most places I'm going this year, I'm saying to people, you've got legislators that are not friendly to what we're doing, but you still need for them to hear from you. Even though you know that they are probably not going to do what you want, they need to know you're out there. I'm going to say to you in Durham, with legislators that are friendly to everything that I've just talked about, I'm going to say to you, they need to hear from you. You don't need to say, I know Paul Lubke's with us, I'm not going to take time to communicate with Paul Lubke. They need to hear from you for at least 2 reasons. One is they need to be able to say in committee meetings and private conversations with legislators and on the floor of the General Assembly, I've gotten, and hold them up, I've gotten letters from 50 constituents who are concerned about tax reform, whatever it is. They need to know that you're behind them in that regard. But the second reason is, think of it as an act of pastoral care. Okay? Think what it would be like to be Paul Lubke in this General Assembly, or Larry Hall, or Floyd McKissick. It's tough. It's tough. And they need to know that they still are valued by their constituents, that they need to know that you care, that you're concerned, and that you are still with them on issues. And so, almost literally as an act of pastoral care, they need to hear from you once in a while to say, thank you for your work on tax reform, or whatever it is. The one other thing I would suggest you do, and again, this is preaching to the choir, and it's preaching to the choir of Durham in many ways, but the stuff you do to give visibility to issues, write letters to the editor, if you have a place to blog, or a network of Facebook friends, or whatever, continue to work for the things that we've been working for decades, even though it's not a great year for doing it. Because we got to keep working at what we've been doing. We can't just roll over and play dead for the next 2 years or 10 years or whatever the duration of this time is. Two resources available from the Council of Churches that I would want you to take advantage of if you're interested in any of these. One is our legislative newsletter, which is called Raleigh Report. Raleigh Report comes out every other week, basically, summarizes bills before the General Assembly, where they are in process, gives you action alerts of things that you can do right now to impact a decision. And then the second resource is our legislative seminar, which happens every other year. We bring together 200 to 250 people who are advocating for progressive social justice, give them a series of briefings on legislative issues, and hear from some really gifted leaders in the field. This year, as an example, this year we'll have a luncheon address by Jean Nickel, who I hope many of you know is the director of the Center on Poverty, Work, and Opportunity. Is that it? Is that have I got it right? At the Chapel Hill Law School. Many of you know Gene. He's a former dean of the law school at Chapel Hill, former dean of the law school of Colorado, former president of the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and is one of the state's most passionate advocates on behalf of people in poverty. And he's going to be addressing "It's better not to be poor" in North Carolina. So that's Thursday, April 11th in Raleigh, and you can find more information about Raleigh Report and about the legislative seminar on our website, and it's easy to remember. It's ncchurches.org, ncchurches.org. So you can sign up for the Raleigh Report newsletter, you can register for the seminar, and I'd love to see you there. I've lost track of my time.
You have time for a few questions.
Okay, time for a question or two, yes.
I want to point out one of the things that George mentioned was the licenses, driver's licenses for the immigrants. And so there are some people, I picked this up, I actually picked up the pink strip at Judea Reform Congregation yesterday morning. I was there with the youth. They were making posters for the crop walk, and here, lo and behold, they had a strip, or these, the tape for pink. So you can actually become in solidarity with folks that are going to have this pink strip across their license. And I know that congregation very much sees it as similar to having to wear the Star of David in Germany. So they're very much.
It's just Scotch tape. You can go
That's
buy
right. It's clear so you can see through it. To make sure you get the kind you can see through so you're not defacing your license.